Welcome back to Homestead Dreamers. I'm Elena and it is January, which means it is time to start thinking about spring gardening. This is my favorite time of year. I get so excited about this topic and I'm so excited to be here sharing it with you and sharing my plans for our spring garden. If you are new to gardening, the first thing that you need to determine is when you need to start things indoors to get ready to plant outdoors. There are multiple tools that are available to help you do this. You can buy a sliding planner that uses your last frost date to help you plan. I'll put a link to one below. You can also use the Farmer's Almanac website. This is really helpful if you're in the United States. I'm not sure if they have other regions available as well, but basically what you do on their website is you enter in your zip code and it gives you a list of plants and when you need to start them indoors and when you need to move them outdoors. This is extremely helpful for someone who's just getting started. I honestly didn't even find this tool until last year, and I wish that I had it sooner. If you're new to gardening, it's also important to know that there are cool weather crops and warm weather crops. Cool weather crops prefer colder temperatures and warm weather crops prefer to be planted outside when it's warm. Depending on where you are located, whether you're in the US or if you're in a different country, this is going to vary on when you're going to actually plant these things. For us, we are located in Pennsylvania, so we are typically planting cool weather crops out in late March, early April, and into May. It depends on how risky you want to be with your last frost date. There are some varieties of plants that can handle a light frost. We like to play more of the risky side, and if we lose a couple plants, that's okay with us. But if you get in some of those plants early and they survive some of those late frosts, you can have harvests sooner, and you can use the timing to your advantage to avoid some garden pests. Once you have a general idea of when you should be planting your spring crops indoors, it's a great time to start thinking about what exactly you want to plant. And this is going to look different for everyone. If you are a past gardener like me, you probably are going to use past experience to help you determine what you want to grow. But if you are someone who is new to growing, this is going to look a little bit different. The biggest key here is growing things that you actually want to eat. In the past, we've grown a few plants and varieties of things that we don't normally eat in our day-to-day diet. And I found myself enjoying the process of actually growing the plant, but once it was ready to harvest, I didn't really know what to do with it or how to prepare it. The example for us is kohlrabi. I grew that about 2 years ago now, and I had a lot of fun growing it and seeing what it looked like, but I really had no interest in actually eating it. So a portion of it ended up going in the compost and the other portion went to the chickens. That's ideally not what you want as a gardener because you put a lot of time, energy, and effort into growing things. So if something ends up in the compost or is given to the chickens, that's not necessarily ideal. When I'm determining what we want to grow for our spring garden, I make a list of plants that are cool weather crops. This includes things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, snap peas, snow peas. There are a wide variety of plants that prefer that cooler weather, and this is the time that I make that initial list. At this point, I don't really make a list of the specific varieties. I'm just making a list of the things that I want to grow in our garden. This is also a great time to note if you want to grow more of a certain plant. For example, last year I think we grew about 10 broccoli plants, and this year I definitely want to increase that number. We grew maybe 6 cabbage plants, and that was a good amount for us for fresh eating. If I wanted to grow some in the fall for storage, then I would probably grow a larger amount of plants. But for the spring, I found that 6 plants is enough for us. We like to grow a lot of kale in the spring. We love kale. We also love freezing kale to use in smoothies and in soups. And then we also give a lot of kale to our chickens. It's one of their favorite vegetables. And so we like to grow excess so that we can give some to them as well. After I have my initial list of seeds, this is typically the time that I start getting seed catalogs in the mail. If you've never received a seed catalog before, you can go onto the company's website and request them for free. There are so many different seed companies that you can purchase from. I'll put a list below to some of the ones that I've purchased from in the past. We primarily purchase all of our seeds from High Mowing Organic Seeds. They offer organic and non-GMO varieties. This is just our preference for our garden, but there are a ton of great seed companies out there, and you should definitely check all of them out. It's also important to note that not all seed companies are gonna have every single variety that you're looking for. So if you see a friend or a coworker growing a specific variety, but the seed company you typically buy from doesn't have it available, go to a different seed company and buy it from them. I know when I first got started gardening, I had no idea where to purchase seeds from, and I initially started my search on Etsy. I'm not sure why I did that. I had no idea that there were actual seed companies that all they do is primarily sell seeds. But now that I'm a gardener, I'm here to tell you that you should always buy your seeds from a reputable seed company. Now, I will say my first year gardening, I initially didn't know that there were seed companies, but I eventually found them and purchased from them. But I would definitely stray away from purchasing seeds from Etsy or Amazon because I'm not exactly sure what kind of quality you'll get with those seeds. And also you may end up with something that you don't want, or maybe something that's invasive. So definitely buy from a reputable company. And like I said, there'll be a list below. You'll have plenty to choose from. The next step for me is, now that I have my list and I have my seed catalogs, this is when you get to be a kid on Christmas and go through the catalog and circle all the varieties that you are interested in planting. I like to read through the descriptions of all the different varieties and then circle accordingly. I definitely have some impulsive purchases every year for varieties that just look really fun to grow, and that's totally fine too. There are several things that I consider when I'm looking at specific varieties. The first thing is grow duration. So I think about when exactly I'm hoping to harvest that plant. The grow durations between varieties usually doesn't vary a ton. It could be anywhere from like 15 to 20 days, but that might be something that matters to you. So take into consideration that grow duration and how long it takes to get to maturity. Also, I like to think about what problems I dealt with in the past. If there's any certain disease or pest I dealt with, do I want to grow a variety that has some resistance to either that disease or pest? And then the third and most important thing is, what is my goal for that plant? So there are certain types of plants and varieties of plants that I like to grow for storage. A good example for this is onions and potatoes. So if you're looking for a long-term storage variety, you're gonna wanna pick one that explicitly states that in the description. If you're looking for just having onions or potatoes for fresh eating, then that's not as big of a deal. But if you are looking to store it long term, you're gonna wanna pick a variety that's meant for that. I tried my best to stay out here because there's better lighting and it's more interesting, but it is really cold and windy. So we're gonna go inside and continue this conversation. This is much better inside. It's so much warmer in here. And I think my go-to place for videos right now is going to be the stairs, even though they're not finished and beautiful yet, but this is the only place we have to actually sit in our house right now. So this is just gonna have to work. One day I hope that I will be making videos in the winter in a greenhouse, but that's one of my homestead dreams. That's not a reality yet, but I'm gonna keep manifesting it until it becomes a reality. Once I've gone through the catalog and circled the varieties I'm interested in planting, I then go back to my seed library of existing seeds I already have on hand, and I start looking through those. Now I know some people probably do this the other way around, where they go through the seeds they already have, make a list of the things they want to grow from that, and then look through a catalog. I like to dream a little bit and go through the catalog first, think about all the things I want to grow, and then I go back and do the more logical thing, which is consider what I already have on hand and then purchase what I need. When I look at those seeds that I have from the past, I look at when I purchased the seed and how many seeds I have left. So seeds are only viable for a certain duration. There are charts that you can find online that list out the typical viability for plants. This will vary depending on how you stored the seeds. So if you stored them in a cool, dark place, they'll probably be viable longer than if they were in a really hot, late place. But that's definitely something that you need to consider when you're looking at your old seeds. The other thing is how many seeds I have left. So if I want to grow, I don't know, 20 broccoli plants, but I only have 6 seeds left, obviously I'm going to want to purchase some more seeds. As I go through my seeds, I will separate them into 2 different piles. So I have one that's like, yes, this is what I'm going to be growing. And then I have another pile that is for me to test the viability. One thing I've learned over time from gardening and seed starting indoors is if I plant seeds that I'm not sure are viable, I can end up wasting a lot of time trying to grow those seeds that may never sprout. And then you kind of get in a pickle where maybe you don't have as many plants as you were hoping because you started these old seeds, or you tried to grow these old seeds, but they didn't end up germinating. And then you're like 2 weeks behind because of it. So what I like to do now that I have a little bit more experience is I'll take those seeds and I'll put them in a wet paper towel in a plastic bag and I'll label them. And then you just make sure that that paper towel stays moist. Give them about 7 to 14 days to germinate depending on the plant and the variety. And then you check on them and see if anything has sprouted. That will give you a good estimation of whether or not your seeds are good enough to plant again this year. If you end up without any of them germinating or none of them sprouting, I just throw those in the compost bin. But regardless, set aside the ones that you think you need to test and do that early on before you need to actually start your seeds indoors. As I go through my existing seeds and I set aside the must plant packets, I also write them down in a list. I actually do my spring garden and summer garden all at the same time because it's just easier for me to order all the seeds at once. I know that this video is about spring garden planning, but you can do your spring and summer garden planning all at once. So I have a list of spring plants and summer plants. I write out the existing varieties that I already have and I'm planning on planting, and then I go back through the catalog and write all of those out as well. Then I go to the company website and I add all of the seeds that I want to purchase to my cart. At this point, I look and see how much it's going to cost and I figure out how much I'm willing to actually spend, and then I kind of narrow it down from there. So there's a lot of times where I'll pick like 3 different broccoli varieties when in reality I probably only need one, but I want to grow more than one and it's really easy to go overboard. So I'll add them all to my cart, see what the total price is, and then take things off to make it make sense for my budget. In the past, I've been blessed with friends and family giving me some of their older seeds that they didn't want. And a lot of them ended up germinating for several years, and I still have a bunch of them. Some of them are from 2014 and they still germinate. And so this year has been probably my biggest seed order ever. I spent close to $100, and that's not a typical spend for me. But with the price of groceries right now, I decided that it was worth it to spend that money, grow an abundance of vegetables in our garden this year, and hopefully have a lot to carry us on into the winter of next year. If you are on a tight budget this year for your garden, one way that you could save money is to split the cost with a friend or coworker or family member. So maybe both of you make a list of the things you want to grow and then swap that list and decide what things that you could grow that are in common, and then that would cut the price in half. I've definitely exchanged seeds with some of my local homesteading friends, or even just plant starts once we've gotten them started. Like sometimes you'll end up with too many kale plants and they'll have too many tomato plants and you can swap them. So that's another idea. Going forward, if this is your first garden, you can potentially save seeds depending on the variety. That's a great way to save money on seeds. I love doing that for flowers. Flowers are so easy to save the seeds from, and if you love having cut flowers in your garden, it's a great way to save some money on those seeds so that you can spend it elsewhere on different vegetable varieties. All the seeds that I ordered actually arrived today, so I'm really excited to get started growing. One thing I like to do every single year is to pick one plant and variety to grow extremely well. And the reason why I do this is because there is such a learning curve to grow everything. There are many different tips and tricks that you can follow. And if you're trying to grow a plant to get the optimal harvest, sometimes it can be challenging to focus on everything. So each year I like to focus on one plant and growing it really well so that now I have that skill set. I don't have to think as hard about growing that plant the following year, but I have that tool in my toolbox for this year. For example, in the past, I struggled to grow broccoli and I failed 2 years straight. And we eat a ton of broccoli. So I was like, okay, I really need to focus on growing broccoli. I need to figure out what I need to do to get a harvest and avoid these cabbage loopers and cabbage worms. And so I focused on that for one whole season. And now I am very skilled at growing broccoli. I know the key to making it successful. And it is so much better than the years that I had struggled. So this year, the plant that I'm picking is onions. I have tried to grow onions multiple years in a row and have never been successful. I always get these really tiny bulbs and it just really does not work out. And so onions are something that you have to start really early, and I need to start them like yesterday. So I'm planning to start those probably in the next 2 to 3 days, because they are something that I'm going to be putting in the ground first. And I really want to be well prepared so that I can get a really good, healthy harvest. We'll see how it goes. If you have tips on growing onions, leave them below. But that is my plant of choice this year. I don't know if anyone else does this, but I find that it's really helpful to kind of focus on a specific plant and variety to grow each year. There are certain plants that I would consider really easy to grow based on my personal experience. When we're talking about a spring garden, I would say kale, lettuce, and snap peas are all pretty easy to grow. Spinach can be a little bit finicky, and so can cauliflower, cabbage, and broccoli. You really have to know what you're doing, and getting the timing down right is really helpful, because there are some garden pests that will come out as soon as it starts getting warm, and if you're not prepared for that, it can be a losing battle. So the more prepared you are up front for that, and the sooner you get your plants in the ground, the better for those plants. There are obviously more steps that are involved with garden planning than just getting your seeds on order. You need to think about how many plants you are going to plant, where you're going to plant them, and what that whole layout is going to look like. This year I purchased a Write in the Rain notebook. I had never heard of them until this past year, but basically the paper is supposed to be formulated in a way that if you get it wet, it doesn't smear the writing on the page. In the past, I've made beautiful graphics of my garden plan, and then I took them down to the garden and they ended up getting wet and it kind of smudged everything and ruined it. So I'm going to be trying it on this paper this year. I like this because it has regular lines like a notebook, and then it also has dotted lines horizontally the other way so that I can kind of use it as a grid. And then you can add your scale here at the bottom. So 1 square equals whatever your scale is. So my plan for this year is to go out to my garden beds, measure them, draw them all out here, and lay out exactly where I plan to plant things and figure out how many of each plant I want to grow. In the past, I've never really been this detailed in my spring garden planning, but this year I plan to fill out the entire garden as much as possible. I never really did it in the past because I found myself always having excess space in the spring, so it wasn't as big of a deal. But if you are looking to maximize the most out of your garden, you're going to want to consider doing something called succession planting, which is essentially you plant your cool weather crops. Once you harvest those, you replace them with warm weather crops. That allows you to maximize your space and grow double, if not triple, the number of plants in one space over one garden season. That's something that I've been implementing over the past 2 years, I would say, and it's working out really, really well. So when I lay out my garden, I'm going to strategically place things, knowing how long they take to grow, when I'll be harvesting them, and figuring out what's going to take their place as soon as they're harvested. Drawing out the beds is really going to help me do that. I'm basically going to make 2 versions of my garden. So I'll have my spring version and then my summer version. Some of my spring crops will still be growing in May and June when I'm ready to plant some of the warm weather things out there. So that's something that I will have to consider whenever I am planning everything out. I experimented last year with interplanting a few things with my broccoli plants. So for example, I planted beans in between my broccoli plants, and that seemed to work really, really well. So the idea was that the broccoli plants were already to a certain size. They were already starting to grow broccoli heads. And at that point in time, I planted beans in between the plants so that by the time I harvested the head of broccoli, I already had seedlings started of beans. So that's another thing that you can consider doing as well. If you're new to gardening, I hope you don't get overwhelmed by all this information. I'm just kind of sharing my thought process and some of the things I've tried in the past and what works for me and some tips for you. Overall, just try to grow some cool weather crops and some warm weather crops. Keep in mind that some of the cool weather crops will kind of continue growing into that warmer season. So you'll have to have some extra space just for warm weather crops. You'll have to replace your cool weather crops when they're done growing with warm weather crops, if that all makes sense. Anyways, I think that that's all I want to say for this specific video. I'll probably do a second video once I have all my beds drawn out and I figure out exactly what I'm going to be planting. I think it could be fun to show you guys the exact varieties I'm planting, how many of each plant I'm planting, why I'm doing that, and then what I plan to experiment with, like with the succession planting specifically. So let me know if that's something you'd be interested in hearing. It could be pretty boring for some people, I guess, but as a gardener, I love hearing people's plans because I'm like, oh, I didn't know I could do that. That sounds really fun. Let me try that as well. So I think that could be really fun. But anyways, thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you on the next one.